Hi, I'm James Huff. I'm an associate professor of engineering education research here at Harding University and a faculty fellow in our honors college. I applied for the career award in the summer of 2020 and was awarded that through the Division of Engineering Education and Centers in the Directorate of Engineering. Today, it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about that grant and especially my process on getting there. I'm going to try to keep my comments pretty brief. I know you're looking at this asynchronously from the conference, and I know that that can be a pretty grueling process. So I'll try to keep this alive and energetic and a little entertaining as well. So my grant focuses on advancing academic well-being by understanding the professional shame experiences of engineering faculty. This was a grant that was funded through the Division of Engineering Education and Centers. And it builds on a trajectory that I had as well. So before I tell you about the career grant, I need to tell you about the grant that I was a PI on first, in which we developed a construct called professional shame. Now, in our past research, my colleagues and I noticed that in engineering education, we were often consumed with this question of identity development. And the idea of that was that could we get people to become engineers and could they be better engineers? All kind of with the idea of building a nationally competitive workforce, internationally competitive workforce for the benefit of our national economy. And while that's all well and good, but in those conversations, in the thinking that undergirds identity development, we noticed just through our own respective research and through the literature and just through experiences as a teacher that often students would come up with work with negotiating the idea of becoming an engineer and respond in ways that were avoidant. Just one example might be the student in your class that you know needs extra support. You're rolling out the red carpet for them to come into your office hours, and yet they don't come. And why is that? Also, the ways that engineering has dominant white male representation that we really haven't seemed to get out of for years and years. Why might that be? What are some emotional mechanisms that might explain some of those inclusive and exclusive processes? Well, I think that's complex, but one emotional state that we did notice was that of the self-conscious emotional state of shame. And in shame, an individual it could be any of us, we is kind of navigating a group. And there is no group quite like a profession, such as engineering, in professions, we codify socially constructed expectations and standards. And then we also have dominant narratives. So narratives that are acceptable ways of being, common ways of being, normal ways of being. When an individual is trying to negotiate with that group, we often interpret how are we meeting these standards? How are we aligning with these narratives? And in this moment that we fail to meet these standards, fail to align with these narratives, there can be this painful emotional state arising from our global sense of devaluating who we are, not just what we do, but feeling wholly inadequate. And therein lies the experience of shame. Individuals also co-produce narratives, however. So if we're an individual in a group, we often think of how we may experience the group, but we rarely in social research think of how we may be propagating the norms of a group. So with that in mind, we operationally defined the construct of professional shame. And professional shame is characterized by 4 important features: perception of failure to meet identity relevant standards in a professional domain. It's a painful emotional state amid failure. It's not a neutral or light one. It really, really hurts to feel shame. And in professional shame, we're not attributing failure to a piece of ourselves. We're attributing failure to our whole self. We feel wholly inadequate. And also in our model of professional shame, we recognize that shame is also not only characterized by what we feel, but how we as individuals replicate, amplify, produce, activate expectations that create the conditions for professional shame to occur. So that is our model of professional shame. This is published in a 2021 article in Journal of Engineering Education, which I'll make available soon. And in this prior work, my colleagues and I did a qualitative mixed method analysis where we analyzed the psychological side through a research method that I regularly practice called interpretative phenomenological analysis, or IPA. So that is an in-depth qualitative study where we're understanding individual lived experiences at a deep level. I'm leaving this QR code here as a way for you to link to the 7 articles, 5 of which are published, 2 of which are submitted, and we summarize our findings, and then we also link to those articles that are published, all of which are open access. And so I leave that for you to see that. In the IPA study, we studied both students who came from marginalized groups with respect to race or gender, and we studied white male students. Our goal was not only to understand how shame connects to the marginalization experiences of students, but also the marginalizing experiences. In other words, could we find emotional mechanisms by which white male students propagated a culture of exclusion, even if unconsciously? We also studied how groups of engineering students behave through focus groups, and we collected ethnographic methods on those focus groups. Through this analysis, that was how we understood not only the content of what the engineering students were saying, but also the process by which they were saying this. In some key insights, and there are many, and if you click on the QR code, you can see those insights that we had, but some key insights that came up is professional shame is just an inevitable emotional state amid professional identity development. If we study identity development, we have to kind of be sensitive to the emotions that may arise in this context if we're concerned about well-being. In professional shame, individuals, particularly white male students, might respond to the shame in ways that just reinforce the problematic sociocultural expectations. So one of our findings was our white male participants would respond in ways that would avoid the shame experience, would hide it, or would minimize it. Minimize the shame experience, but only amplify the expectations that they feel that they failed to meet, not only for themselves, but also for others. And I would encourage you to look at our work to see where that finding plays out. And finally, students with minoritized identities experience minoritization amid shame. And that's important in that students with identities that were marginalized, those particular identities would come into the overall experience of shame. So if the student was a woman of color, being a woman of color was connected to the overall holistic shame experience. And there were questions about an identity that was beyond anything they were doing, but a categorization that they deeply connected to. The same would be, so if white women experience shame, not their racial background, but their status as a woman would enter into the shame experience. So they would question, is this because I'm a woman? And for men of color, racial or ethnic background, but not so much gender, would enter into this shame experience. And so we think this is an emotional mechanism that is important to understand. And that was really the foundation of a grant for which I was the principal investigator. And these were my collaborators on the grant, Dr. Joe Valter and Nikki Sohutska from the University of Georgia were my co-PIs. And then we had several, as you can see, we had several contribute to the overall grant that are listed here. I share with you that initial grant because that really set the theoretical stage for my career grant that I submitted in 2020. So in this career grant, I wanted to, our work really pointed us to a culture of engineering that was rich in professional shame. And that inspired me personally to ask, how is this culture being propagated? Whose experiences do we really need to understand? Do we really need to prioritize to really change this culture? And there is a lot of work in engineering education on understanding students. We often treat students as dynamic, complex individuals with emotional, personal learning needs that we seek to understand. We often treat in education research broadly faculty as sort of the walking, talking robots of pedagogical mechanisms that can just change the students' well-being and the students' learning needs. I wanted to shift that in this career grant. So I worked from the same construct we had defined, professional shame, but I wanted to see it in a bigger and altogether different way. How do faculty experience professional shame in their roles as faculty? And how can we shift not only how they meet their own emotional needs, but how they create emotional cultures? If we place faculty in this model, we see that faculty are also dealing with these same questions, but in very different ways than students. Faculty who are both connected to the profession of academia, profession of engineering, and institutional connection, there is a complex experience of shame to understand. And I think one that has especially surfaced in the past 2 years amid COVID, amid an awakening of systemic racism in this country, and an awakening to something that has always been present and problematic. So in this grant, I'm in the first year of this grant, and I'm using IPA to understand the individual experiences of faculty. And I'm broadening the analysis with a grounded theory using a constructivist method to understand how cultures of shame are created. And I'll show you my objectives on the grant here, but that is the anchoring point of this work. I'll use these findings to train engineering faculty and engineering departments, and package together customized specific training to advance emotional and academic well-being in engineering academic settings. I should mention too that this career grant is not the totality of what I'm doing, like it is for any of us. I'm also leveraging students that I work with through the Honors College. I have one student, he's an accounting student, and we're studying professional shame in accounting students. I have another student looking at Black engineering students amid faculty interactions and the shame that they experience there. And while those are related to this grant, I kind of share that because authentically, the career grant is really leading an holistic overall research agenda that allows me to have open doors that amplify the work of students and benefit them. Just to maybe share, here is the overall objectives for my grant. So my first objective is to look at shame in the lived experiences of faculty. And then my second objective is to look at shame within departmental cultures. And then in the educational plan, I capture that in an objective. It's to build training to nurture well-being in engineering departments. And I won't go into this in detail, but this was my overall work plan, which you can see when we think of research and education integration. I wanted to make sure that I wanted to hold myself accountable. Like, am I putting my education plan in an aim? Am I actually integrating this in a meaningful way? And we can maybe talk about that more in the discussion breakout. I want to acknowledge the work of my lab. Dr. Amy Brooks is my postdoctoral researcher, and then my undergraduate research assistants are pictured there as well. And they mean the world to me. They are my lab family, and we have fun in doing this work together. And now I want to shift the conversation to my process of getting a career grant. I imagine you're going to hear a lot of great advice across the presentations. So I wanted to try something different, and I wanted to kind of maybe share some bad advice for submitting a career grant. And I'll follow up with better advice that did work for me. But I want to share the bad advice just to maybe name it, make it visible. And this is, I've probably heard this advice from actual other people. But I have to tell you that this is largely brought to you by my inner critic. This is not necessarily things that people told me. These are things that I conceptualized. So first, just some background. I graduated in 2014 with a PhD in engineering education at Purdue, and I began an assistant professor role at Harding here. I actually was an instructor there before going off for my PhD, went on a sabbatical to get my PhD, and returned as part of that arrangement. So I began my assistant professor role in 2014 at Harding University, which is a private faith-based university in Arkansas. My first attempt with the career award was in 2015. That was after the first year. I submitted to EEC. I did not win the career award, and I learned a lot from that experience. But that was really the foundational attempt that I took to really formulate my ideas into an overall career agenda. And my second and final attempt was in 2020. You might note that that was the last time that I could have applied. It was not, I did not take all 3 attempts, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So let's get to the bad advice. Bad advice number 1, your value is tied up in winning this award. This was something that I heard from myself, especially the first time I wrote this grant. It was a very stressful experience. The summer of 2015 was generally not a great summer. I would spend lots of times thinking about writing. I ultimately did produce a 15-page document. But I think but whenever we write a career grant, we are writing something that is this holistic container of something that we want to be. And it can feel like a very vulnerable experience to get that on the page. Believing that this career grant is going to connect to who I am as a whole person was something that was generally unproductive for me in the first time. And in the second time, I'm very grateful that that was not how I approached a career grant the second time. It was something that I got to do. It was something that energized me, but I was going to still be standing whether or not this award happened. And I'll also tell you this too. there is a hot minute that you are an award winner for the career grant. Now that I'm in year one, I have spent considerably more time as an investigator on this grant than I have as an award recipient. Um, so it has been really amazing. It has opened up some powerful doors for me personally and professionally. Um, but I also have very close colleagues and collaborators who did not win the career grant, and not winning the career grant opened some really cool collaborative ways forward that they're living out, and it is all okay. And I think it's important to just kind of say that to ourselves, that this is not where my value is tied up. Um, for me, I think as a person of faith, for me, holistically, that has certain deep meaning. But even I think for all of us who are looking at this from a professional perspective, we have many stories where our value does not have even our value to our institution, to our department, does not have to be tied up to winning this award. So I think that's a foundational piece. I would just want to name that and call that expectation in, and perhaps collectively encourage us to reject that expectation. The second piece of bad advice that I really conceptualized and internalized the first time was to go it alone. And that was in the first grant, I was an island. I contained everything. I believed that I had to, my career grant was just inside this tank. Every single sentence was way too precious to get out to the community. And so I really isolated myself in writing a grant. And ironically, it was a grant that was similar ideas as the grant I'm on now, and that engineering people are whole people, and that they need community. I was ironically writing this out in a very isolated way. In the second time I wrote the grant, 5 years later, I set that advice aside in a major way. I connected with a career mentor in January of 2020. That was really when I started my major writing efforts a few months before. Dr. Julie Martin from The Ohio State University was my career grant mentor. And she was so generous with her feedback. We met on at least a monthly basis, sometimes every other week. And those, not for long, but those meetings kind of gave me natural accountability. In the end, I involved more than a dozen people looking at my grant. So one major first draft that I sent out to previous career winners who were in my network in June. And then I did another draft in early July and sent that out to also mostly previous career awardees as well. There is a community waiting for you. I think many career winners have a state of gratitude like myself, and please reach out to those you know to support you in a community. Now, there is good reason, of course, to not share everything with everyone before a grant is settled. However, I would not encourage going it alone. I would encourage finding your community, finding your people to develop this work. This third piece of bad advice that I internalized was just kind of chunk it in and see if it sticks. So, let's just get it into NSF and see if that's going to stick. I would not recognize that as good advice right now, and I'll tell you why. It leads to not strong writing. So I this is the first page of my winning grant. Every single sentence was very intentional. The pagination was intentional. The objectives were intentionally phrased. And this was not a first draft. the aligning with the career mission and naming my career mission, all of that is very intentional. That took a lot of thought. That took a lot of effort. Making this graphic took a lot of intention, a lot of iteration, going back to the community, a lot of refining, a lot of feedback. My first attempt of a grant, I'm just going to show you my first page here, was not nearly as intentional. It was getting words on a page. I do have my objectives there in the first, but they aren't as good as the career grant. And I am really not, I have about 8 pages of literature review following this. I'm not going to go into all of it, but man, it was an effort of just throwing it in and seeing if it sticks. And of course, it did not stick because it wasn't really developed with quality. I learned from that, and I really invested in quality in writing the grant. I'll tell you one story as well. The summer before I submitted, in summer 2019, I was met with a choice. Do I submit the career grant, or do I submit a foundational peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Engineering Education that would ultimately lead the way to my career grant? In writing, that is one academic task. No matter where you're from, there is only one writer. And I decided to dedicate my headspace that first summer in 2019 with the peer-reviewed article, which was a risk, but it was a risk that was worth taking. It only set up the career grant for a deeper, more thoughtful space. And I was I didn't need anyone to tell me that would be a better approach. That was kind of just self-evident, and it was. By the time I submitted the career grant, that article that we had submitted was in minor revisions. I was able to kind of claim theoretical substance from my past work that led in and formed the foundation to the grant. Bad advice number 4, only certain types of institutions win this award, and a hint, it isn't yours. Coming from a private faith-based university in Arkansas, an underfunded state with the National Science Foundation, generally speaking, in a state in which there have only been, I was the second career awardee that was not in the University of Arkansas system, at a university in which had never won an NSF grant. Even the grant I was a PI for, I was a PI for a grant that was housed at another institution. That's a long story. But, and no one in our peer institutions, by any way you could claim a peer institution, had won a career award. There was plenty of reasons for me to think about this advice. There was plenty of reason for me to try to act like I was at a research institution. And that's what I tried to do the first time around, and it didn't work. People see right through that. The thing is, my university has assets to do deep, thoughtful work that requires in-depth thinking, that requires in-depth analysis. The work that I'm claiming and actualizing in this career grant, my university has that asset by not having the pressure to maintain 4 to 6 projects at any given time. I have headspace. That's an asset. The faith-based nature of my institution is an asset when I consider the culture of care that I'm really trying to create in scholarship. That aligns. That's an asset. And I recognize I didn't try to do things in my career grant that aren't really possible for my institution. I don't have PhD students here. I didn't put PhD students on the grant. I could bring a postdoc here, but I know postdocs really want to build their career at Research One spaces to enter tenure track jobs. So I worked with a collaborator to go 50% on a postdoc, and that's our arrangement now, and it's working out wonderfully. I work with my undergraduates very intentionally and thoughtfully, and if you look at the publications that I shared with you earlier, undergraduates are represented in major publications. That is what I care about, and I decided to harness the assets of my institutions rather than the deficit. And the final piece of bad advice that I want to share is that the thought that intellectual merit is somehow more important than broader impacts. Not at all. That couldn't be further from the truth. I wouldn't say it's the other way around either, but I think when we're writing this grant, we want to think of ourselves as finding the theory or finding the gap in the literature. But why does that gap ultimately matter? How is that going to change anything? Briefly, I'll go back to my documents that I had and go back to my first page. What does it mean to be an engineer? This is on the grant that didn't take. It is a question engineering students ask beyond before they embark on their degree programs, and one they continue to engage well beyond college graduation, ... You can look at that, pause it. Whew. If you're not an identity researcher, you're not really captivated by this opening paragraph. And I see that now. I am an identity researcher. It met my curiosity, but it wasn't necessary for the community. This first opening paragraph here, we stand at a watershed moment in engineering education research and practice. We are faced with a globalized pandemic that has destabilized higher education while also being confronted by heightened awareness of systemic racism. You can see that this is setting a stage that grabs everyone. There is a soul to this second career grant, that one that really wasn't there. There is a concern for a broader changing the world that really wasn't there in my first iteration. So I want to really encourage people to integrate their understanding of intellectual merit and broader impact and let that come out in the narrative, and especially the first page. One of the hardest pieces of advice that I heard was, this is not, in one of my earlier drafts, this is not an inspired grant. I get that. So let's do inspired work, and let's do something that we're excited about. As I said, there's a hot minute you're an awardee. The rest, you're an investigator. Do the work in which you want to be an investigator, to stay with it. And all the best as you prepare your projects. Thank you.